evening. Welcome to the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology and Neuroscience. I'm Tony David. I'm the Vice Dean for Academic Psychiatry. And welcome to all guests, and I believe we've got people who have travelled from as far as the USA, Belgium, Cambridge even. You're all very, very welcome to this great occasion. So it's a pleasure to introduce Edmund Barke. He did his first degree in Bangor. He did his PhD in the University of Exeter, and then did his postdoc here in the Institute of Psychiatry in Michael Rutter's department. And I think there he really blossomed under Eric Taylor's guidance and got interested particularly in ADHD, but many other things. Of course, he was snapped up by the University of Southampton, worked his way through the ranks and became the head of department and professor there. He's also been a professor, a visiting professor or honorary professor in many other places, including the University of California, in South Africa, as well as Ghent, in Denmark, Sussex, New York. But I'm pleased to say this is the first time he's been asked to give an inaugural lecture, so we're absolutely delighted that it's a first for all of us. Edmund's work is very broad. I guess in the field of ADHD, which we're going to hear about, it spans phenomenology, clinical trials, the basic neuroscience and cognitive neuroscience and imaging. But of course he's done many other things, and in particular he took on Sir Michael Rutter's amazing adoption study of Romanian children, which was published recently in The Lancet, a really astonishing piece of work, and great that Edmund's been able to carry on that tradition. But today we're going to hear about ADHD from many points of view and perspectives. I'm really looking forward to it. There may be time for questions afterwards, and then I'll invite Eric Taylor to give a vote of thanks. But first of all, Edmund, your inaugural lecture.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Tony, for that very kind introduction. And first of all, I'd like to thank Claire, Hannah and Trevor for arranging this event so expertly. And thanks to everyone for coming. I'm really overwhelmed by the presence of so many incredibly eminent colleagues and friends, many of whom have travelled an awfully long way to be here. I don't quite know what to say, but I really do appreciate your presence here. My family are also here, which is wonderful. My dad is here. He's actually sitting a little bit too close. A little bit intimidating, so it's quite nerve-wracking. I've never spoken in public before in front of my dad. But given the breaking news from the STDP that inaugurals are almost 100% heritable, at least if it's really bad, you can blame my dad for about 50% of it. Okay. My brother's here with his Paul, with his family, and his son Carrick actually wants to be a psychologist, at least at the moment, and we'll see after about an hour whether you still want to be. My wonderful wife is here, Funke, and it's a good opportunity for me, having been my first inaugural, to thank her for all the sacrifices she'd made for my career and for our family. Thank you, darling. And my kids are here, and they know me, as some of you know me very well, and so they actually imposed some rules on my behaviour during the talk. So, the principle being no inappropriate over-exuberance. And so, for instance, they know I love to dance, as all their friends actually know I love to dance when they come around, and many of you know that, I guess, too. I think this is a famous Jim Swanson snap from a party we had in Greece once, and they know I love to sing. And you'll notice here, if the eagle-eyed amongst you, so the person playing Tammy Terrell to my Marvin Gaye is actually Javier Castellanos, the world-famous neuroscientist. So you're really going for it, you can see there. We had quite an evening. But there'll be no dancing and there'll be no singing, so you can rest assured, kids, that you're not going to be too embarrassed, hopefully. So the title I took was ADHD as Delay Aversion, and then a subtitle, The Curious Evolution of an Unlikely Idea. Well, actually, I thought it could actually equally be The Curious Evolution of an Unlikely Scientist as a subtitle. Because the more I thought about it, the more I thought, well, in order to understand my interest in ADHD and also where the unlikely idea of delay aversion comes from, you've got to know a little bit about where I come from and my background and how I got in to research and to science. So it's going to be kind of an autobiographical inaugural, and in my case, that has to start with school. So school was a disaster for me. I was a living embodiment of academic underachievement or even non-achievement. My dad's smiling here. And of course now it's just, you know, an intervening variable in a path model that we might do, that Jim Stevenson might do, for instance, between genes, environment, school failure, life of crime. That sort of, you know, that sort of pathway. I think Jim actually did do a model like that once. And so I thought, in honour of Jim and the other structural equation modelers in the room, I would actually present my path into science as a path analytical model. And I've never talked about this in public before, but actually I think hopefully you'll see the relevance. And I think it's quite good to talk about those factors that are non-financial, that potentially influence the science that we do. So there he is, the originating cause. That's Eddie Barke. Great genes, half Irish, half English. Great environment, loving family environment, growing up in the Catholic faith in a strong Irish Catholic parish around St Mary's in Derby. Derby being, of course, the jewel in the industrial crown of Britain. And it was a great time to be in Derby, because people who know about culture will know that we won the Football League in 1972 under these two gentlemen, Brian Clough and Peter Taylor. Anyway, I digress. Back to this chap. And the first path's really easy to draw in. Eddie Barke predicts, that's my school photo, by the way. Eddie Barke predicts abject school failure, but you won't be surprised to know that there are two indirect pathways to this abject school failure. One of them is cognitive, and the other is motivational. So the cognitive pathway, I think you would describe it as underpinned by a love-hate relationship with language and words. So I used to love language when it was coming out of my mouth. And it came out of my mouth all the time, irrespective of where I was at the time, classrooms, assemblies, in church, anywhere. So I did spend an awful lot of time outside of the classroom and in front of Sister Annunziata's office, who was the head mistress then. I mean, probably people, so that's the hate. I hated it when people wrote it down and I had to read it. Or I had to write it down and spell it. I just didn't get that for a long, long time. And now they used to call that word blindness or learning problems. Now they call it dyslexia, of course. At my school, they had a different term for it. It was quite a technical term. Late 60s, early 70s. If you weren't there, you wouldn't get what schools were like then. So the motivation pathway, that we could we might call it task avoidance. And so I spent most of my time trying to avoid any work at school if I possibly could. And of course, my teachers had a technical term for that too. But some of the side effects of task avoidance were pretty interesting. So, for instance, some of you know, it's not a very well kept secret, that I was the founding member of the greatest punk rock band in the Midlands. There's two of my colleagues that remember these, probably with horror. It's Martin Roper and Dougie Bell, school friends, and we formed Antipasti together. And for those of you who missed the joys of punk rock in the 1970s, No. Go back. No. That was the single. That was the first single cover, by the way. It's rather nice. It acts of somebody's head. Oh. You've got to sing along if you know the lyrics. The chorus is no Maggie Thatcher and no Bill O'Reilly. So I thought you'd like to sing that one, actually. Okay, so in Wikipedia, there's a lot on Wikipedia, there's a lot on YouTube, unfortunately, about this, and they're described as commercially successful but critically reviled second-generation punk rock. Unfortunately, when I left after 12 months at the age of 17, they were just critically reviled. So, abject school failure, critically reviled, things didn't look too good. Didn't look too rosy at that point. And, of course, the developmental psychopathologists are thinking to themselves, you know what this guy needs? He needs a turning point. And so my first turning point came when my mum, God rest her soul, she knew a lady from the church who was very dyslexic, set up the Derby Dyslexia Centre to look to help people. But she also knew this gentleman. And this is Professor Tim Miles. Some of you will know Tim, would have remembered Tim. Died maybe 5 or 6 years ago. He had the OBE for services to dyslexia, in fact. And Tim is wonderful in the vanguard of a much more enlightened approach to learning difficulties in dyslexia. And he also had persuaded the University College of North Wales to release 2 places to people like me, who had left school without any qualifications. And so I'm totally indebted to Tim and to Mrs. Marr, the lady, and to my mum, of course, for that turning point in my life, because it opened up for me a university education, which I wasn't expecting at that point, of course. And more importantly for today's talk, it gave me an intellectual formation that really grounded the work that I went on to do, I think, in terms of ADHD and particularly in delay aversion. So Tim, I think there's 4 things that I took from my university education. I mean, that doesn't sound a lot, but it's 4 more than I took from school, so it's not too bad. So Tim taught me, and if you know Tim, he had a book called Some Conceptual Issues in Psychology. So he was very interested in philosophy and linguistic philosophy, and so he really taught us to focus on distinguishing conceptual questions from empirical questions. Get your concepts right, and then address the empirical questions. Fergus Lowe, his colleague in Bangor, was probably the only radical behaviourist Skinnerian in the whole of England, and I fell under his care. And of course, Skinner wrote lots of rubbish, but he did do one important thing. He taught us to focus on the function of a behaviour if you want to explain why it exists, and not on the form. He called it a formalistic fallacy. If you focus on the form, you're going to misunderstand why the behaviour is occurring. So a functional analysis. So get your concepts right, focus on the function. Then Paul Webley, taken too soon from us after a very distinguished career in university administration as director of SOAS in the end. He was my PhD supervisor at Exeter, and he taught me this: take the child's point of view when you're thinking about explanations of their behaviour. Don't impose. And I think the concept of the psychologist's fallacy comes to mind here. Don't impose your view, take the view of the person you're studying. And then Stephen, who I'm delighted to say is here as my other supervisor, and Stephen's a brilliant behavioural economist, and he taught me that really all actions are choices. It's all the result of choice under constraint and in the context of other factors. So putting that all together, I had a sort of scientific orientation that then I could, I was kind of all tooled up, ready to go on and to try and understand something. And I added a bit of the old contrarian spirit. I think I still have that, and that is always question received wisdom, and always doubt the dominant view, I guess, and put together. So I was ready to go, but where would I go? So then I had the second major turning point. It came in the form of this gentleman who's sitting here on the right-hand side of the thing, and I had to add in the BPS bulletin, and it said, research fellow required for hyperkinetic disorder. I thought, what the hell is hyperkinetic disorder? So I went away and read it, and it said things like can't stand still, can't concentrate, always talking, etc. It's a bit of an old friend, actually. So I applied, and I'm assuming there were no other candidates because I got the job. But then you put it in context and you see, you can see it's not just a focus of my research, it's more important to me than that in terms of trying to understand and help people with these problems. So in terms of the process, I went back through all the papers and I tried to pick out what the key sort of turning points in the concept of delay aversion were. Sort of identified 5, and then the future, which I know is going to be even better than the previous periods. So, of course, Eric was the most perfect boss to work for, generous, kind, very insightful, and, of course, brilliantly clever. So not a bad combination. And he's also very modest, so he probably wouldn't like me to say that. But we worked together. I had a day job, which was humping a big portable... If you've been in a big portable computer, they're enormous in those days. I had to hump it around Newham. 81 primary schools I visited in Newham without a car, so that's pretty good. And in the evenings I did delay aversion. And so the birth of the concept came in really 92 when we published this paper. And it really reflected the work we'd done up to that point, I think, thinking about trying to explain a pattern of behaviour in ADHD, which is really diagnostic of ADHD. And that's impulsiveness, or impulsivity, or impulsive choice. So what do we mean by impulsive choice? So we're often faced with these sorts of choices all the time, in fact. Small reward now or a large reward in the future. Pretty much the whole of life is about these sorts of choices. Kids with ADHD, almost by definition, because it's actually part of the diagnosis, will choose the small immediate reward. And of course, I came to this thinking, why? Why are they doing that? And of course, the field was telling me one thing. So people like the brilliant Russell Barke would have this dysfunctional view, focus on dysfunction, a classical disease model, focus on dysfunction, and he'd argue that deficits in higher order cognition mean that children with ADHD lack the self-control to wait for rewards. They can't wait for rewards. Now, of course, I was thinking a different point of view. I'd come with a different paradigm because of the influence of Fergus and Paul and Stephen, and I was thinking, well, perhaps it's not due to a self-control failure, as its form suggests. Perhaps it's functional from the child's point of view. Then you say, well, what function could it serve? This apparently dysfunctional, impairing choice of immediacy over delayed reward. Where delayed reward's bigger, why wouldn't you choose the delayed reward? Well, let's think about it. So a little thought experiment. So imagine you're waiting. LL always means large later reward. You're waiting for a reward. You can see I don't like waiting, that's why I'm clicking on fast. And you get the reward, okay? You get your 2 points. And then you think, right, okay, I did that, and I get another option. This time I get offered a small reward, but it's sooner, okay? And you choose that. And you think, so you've chosen that. The question then, the thought experiment is, why did you do that? So if Russell Barkley's right, basically you lack self-control. You can't wait for that large reward. You have to go for the small reward, even if you lose rewards, even if it's impairing or dysfunctional. From the economic perspective, it's about the value of the small reward. What value could that reward have? It might be more value to you than the large reward. One possibility is that it maximizes the amount of rewards you can get overall. Yeah? The second possibility, of course, is that it minimises delay overall. So, as I say, if Russell's right, then basically, if Russell's right and it's a lack of self-control, you're going to choose the small reward whatever the circumstances, because you can't wait. If the economics model is right, then you're going to choose it if you value it. Now, we can rule out the reward maximizer view, of course, if we limit the number of choices. Say we have 10 choices. If you have 10 choices, it's always going to be best to choose a large choice on each one to get the most reward. Yeah? So we can kind of control for that, take that out of the equation. So for instance, here you can see that If you choose a large reward, in this case 20 times, you get 40 rewards. If you choose a small reward 20 times, you get 20 rewards. So obviously you're losing rewards if you choose the small immediate reward. So that can't be the function in this case. But of course, if you choose a small reward, you get, in this model, you get a quarter of the delay. So it could be that you're trying to minimize the amount of delay. So the problem we've got there, of course, is that the choice of the small immediate reward is predicted both by the self-control breakdown model and by the delay minimization model. So what do? You think about the experiments you did with your PhD supervisors, and you put in a period of post-reward delay. So you can see now, so you've got the wait, you've got a short wait, then you've got the reward, then you've got a long wait, then you've got another trial. But clearly, choosing the small reward now doesn't escape delay. You've got just the same amount of delay, whichever you choose. You can't, it's not functional in that sense anymore. So in this situation, a delay minimizer should be indifferent between these two options. Yeah? You shouldn't really care which you choose because you can't do what you want to do, which is escape to minimize the delay. You may as well choose the big one, in fact, because seeing as you can't escape delay, you may as well then just go for the big one anyway. It's the same amount of delay. So our first experiment, I think it was important to spend a bit of time on that because just to get such a different concept, is that we had two conditions. In the first condition, it included the post-reward delay period. Yeah? And so you couldn't escape delay in that situation by choosing the small reward. In the second condition, you could escape delay. You had 20 trials, by the way, so you could escape delay and reduce the whole experiment and get out quickly. But of course, you have to sacrifice rewards then. You end up with half the amount of rewards. So what did we find? Nothing, apparently. Okay, hold on. Yeah. So in the two conditions, so in the no delay escape condition, we found that they had no problem waiting at all, the ADHD kids. So where they couldn't escape delay, they waited just like the controls. So clearly it didn't look like they've got a breakdown in self-control in this study. In the delay escape condition, we find what you predict from the delay minimization model. That when they could escape delay with the small immediate reward, they would. Okay? And that was really quite a new perspective on this whole issue of impulsive. Very context-dependent, very economic, actually. We've had a large-scale replication of this as part of the IMAGE and Unithides collaboration. And this is Steve Ferrone, who led the IMAGE study, a big multi-centre genetic study of ADHD, which we're involved with. And this is Joe Sargent on the, well, you didn't say which one was which, but this is Joe Sargent on this side. And Joe's been a leader of European ADHD science. And I just thought I wanted to acknowledge and mention that. So basically, this was a very large study, 416 ADHD kids, 112 controls, and it wasn't exactly the same. The effects were smaller, but I always call it the Cat-Stevens effect, because as you know, the first cut is always the deepest in research. You can use that, it's not patented. Okay, so the conclusions we drew that ADHD individuals can wait for delayed rewards. Yeah? They're not impulsive in that sense. They don't have a failure of self-control. But they choose a small reward in certain circumstances where they value it because they can reduce overall delay. So we coined at that point the term delay aversion. It was actually, a tear came to my eye when I reread that paper and I saw for the first time delay aversion in the paper, 1992. So then we thought, well, let's push the boat out. Let's see if this functional account around delay aversion can explain the other symptoms of ADHD. Inattentiveness and hyperactivity. So impulsiveness, inattentiveness, and hyperactivity. And we thought, yeah, maybe they can. So if you take delay minimization as your goal, as your function that you're trying to achieve in the environment, if you can escape delay, we've just talked about that, you basically choose the sooner reward, you escape delay. And it looks like impulsiveness. What if you can't escape delay? Like now, unless you're really willing to be embarrassed and walking out in the front. So what if you can't do that? What do you do if you're really bored now? Well, what we figured out was what you try and do is you try and change the way delay feels. You try and speed up the passage of time during delay to make it less aversive. So you transform delay. And we argue that the functions of inattention, the excess activity and disruptiveness actually are serving that function. And when you say this, it sounds like it's conscious. Of course, it's not conscious. These are learned behaviours. And they're reinforced because they change the nature of delay. That's the Skinnerian bit. Not as unlikely as it sounds, it turns out, because as we know, I just love this, as we know, time is a psychologically malleable thing. Sometimes it flies, sometimes it stops. And experiments show that if you focus your attention on interesting things in your environment, you can make it go quicker. If you fidget, if you evoke stimulation from the environment, you can make it go quicker. Perhaps that's the function of ADHD, inattention and overactivity. That's what we thought. And then we did, over the years, we've run a few experiments with all the people that I've collaborated with over the years. And some of the things we found are quite interesting in this regard. So ADHD kids are more active and inattentive during delay. Okay? So, fits in. It's not proof, but it fits in, it's consistent. Attention is more off task when stimuli are delayed. That's what we do with Roliand in Ghent. Such attention is correlated with other measures of delay aversion, like impulsive choice. It seems to form a little broader phenotype of delay aversion. And stimulation during delay reduces symptoms, where you don't need to act on the environment because the stimulation is being put in there for you. Not completely proof, but consistent with the model. Things move on. So the next period that we had, I called it delay aversion against the world. I think you like that Pascal reference to Brycehead Revisited. So delay aversion. So the next 10 years were really like refining and trying to explain it to people, because it's so different paradigm from the way we think about it in terms of disease and disorder and dysfunction in psychiatric conditions. And nobody was very interested, to be absolutely honest. Hardly ever cited all the studies we did, until I had a visit from a friend of many of ours, Howard Abacoff. And Howard came over from New York, one of the funniest guys actually you'll meet. He came over from New York and he said, I really like that delay aversion concept, but, I don't really believe it. I like the idea, but what I want to do is I want to test it against the dominant model in a head-to-head study. Where are all the head-to-head studies? They're great. I mean, which is right, delay aversion or inhibitory executive failure? So those are the two we put those against each other. And this was a follow-up study, a follow-on study from the MTA, which is a big study that Jim Swanson, who's in the audience, is involved with. And Mary Salanto was the first author, and then Howard Abacoff was the second author. And they basically were the honest brokers. They had no horse in the race here, which was right, which was wrong. So, crucially, they involved both camps. The delay aversion camp, which was, by then it was me, Mary. The other camp, which was enormous. And they designed it, they instigated it. It's a great model for testing theories. Pick your best task, kind of quite American. Pick your best task. I only had one task, so it was easy. I picked the choice task. They picked the stop signal task. Many people know the stop signal task, a very clever task developed by Gordon Logan. And basically, it's a computerized task. There's a stimulus or a picture appears on the computer, and that's to tell you to start to respond. And then, quite soon after that, there's a stop task, a stop signal, and you have to withdraw your response. And you can vary those, and you can measure what's called a stop signal reaction time, which is a kind of measure of efficiency of stopping. So those are two tasks. Oh, sorry, there's little pictures of them. You know the one on the right-hand side. And what did we find? Well, this was actually an incredibly important study for the whole field of ADHD. And that we found that these two constructs of impulsiveness or inhibition and delay aversion were completely uncorrelated. So they're separate processes in this sample. It's really important. Distinct processes. But crucially, they both predicted ADHD membership. Now we're scratching our head because we thought we were going to find out the truth. Delay aversion is explaining ADHD, or start again because inhibitory control explained ADHD. But what we found was they actually both explained a bit of ADHD. And then it became clear that when you looked at the people on an individual case-by-case basis, what you found was there was a group of ADHD kids who only had delay aversion, and there was a group who only had inhibitory control. So this was motivated a whole slew of very pretty diagrams in the field, basically partitioning ADHD into different groups with distinct neuropsychological profiles. And you can see that in each of them, delay aversion, or in 3 of them at least, is a distinct grouping. In 2 of them, it's around about 30 to 40% of the population show delay aversion. So, in a sense, we did better than we thought we'd do, because we had nothing to lose from this head-to-head. We were actually relevant to about 40% of cases of ADHD. But more importantly, it highlighted the heterogeneity of neuropsychology within ADHD. And this has been a message, another paradigm shift in a way, and this has been a message people have found very hard to accept, some people in the field, that it's a heterogeneous condition. But of course in other fields like autism and so forth, commonly accepted now. So, okay, so we had this data and I thought, golly, what do we do with that? What do we do with that? How do we make sense of that? And at this time, in the next 4 or 5 years, published a series of theoretical papers. I kind of became obsessed with boxers and arrows during this period. I had more arrows than a Native American's quiver, you could say. Boom, boom. So, but during this period, I developed a very close relationship with this wonderful scientist and person, again, sadly died maybe 6 or 7 years ago. And this is Terry Sack-Bolden. And Terry knew everything you could possibly know about the neurobiology of reward processors. And I went to spend time with him. We had a wonderful time as a family in Norway, and we became very close friends, and very sadly missed. But he also influenced my science. So he taught me everything I knew about neurobiology of reward, for sure. So we tried to characterize these 2 groups, and we characterized them as 2 pathways. We've got a dual pathway model of ADHD. We argued that one pathway was underpinned by alterations in reward circuits in the brain that led to a short and delay reward gradient, or an increased discounting of the value of future rewards. And then that led on to delay aversion. So delay aversion now is like a developmental consequence of a prior fundamental problem in reward processing. And then the other pathway was the executive function pathway. And these both led to the same manifestation of ADHD. So not one, what wasn't the symptom profile was different. It was the same symptom profile. Crucially, in the motivational pathway, the environment then became an important component, because we argued, how do you get from reward deficits to delay aversion? And we thought, well, one possibility is that this pattern of reward-related behaviour leads to failures to wait for rewards, impulsiveness, etc., that evokes a negative response from its environment, criticism and hostility from parents. That then feeds back into creating a link between aversive environments, delay environments, and a sort of a negative affective response in the person, so like conditioned affective negative response. In terms of the neurobiology, and I can see Trevor Robbins right in front of me, just behind my dad, actually. This is really spooky. So I hope I get this right. So one of the pathways we saw as linked to the more ventral frontal striatal circuits within the brain, very roughly in this region of the brain. The other pathway, which is the executive pathway, the more dorsal frontostriatal regions, and both of them modulated heavily by dopamine, of course, and noradrenaline. But in this, I just cut this out from the paper, just say where we were at the time. We focus on the dopamine hypothesis of ADHD. So that was a kind of causal modelling period. This is all a snapshot, because obviously we haven't got forever. But so the next question we asked is, so why do some people get delay aversion, not others? Is there a biological difference in people's sensitivity to how they experience aversive events? Some individuals may be more affected by aversive events and experiences, and so more likely to develop delay aversion because of this differential susceptibility, a popular term now. So the first question is, where in the brain then is this response to negative experiences and events. And we know after animal studies, lots of human studies with clinical populations, anxious and depressed people, that the amygdala, this little almond-shaped structure at the end of the hippocampus, is really important and is differentially activated by negative experiences. And we know that it's heavily innervated by another neurotransmitter, not dopamine this time, serotonin. And serotonin alters the function of the amygdala in response to negative events. And this gives me a chance to mention two people, because the first thing we looked at was whether serotonin genes that modify the function of amygdala responses might predispose some people to delay aversion. And this is really just a chance to mention Jim Stevenson and Jim Swanson, the two Jims, I just realised, had a massive influence on my career. Jim was a long-standing colleague at the University of Southampton, and Jim a long-standing collaborator, and known Jim for, golly, an awfully long time. And Jim managed to come, so that's wonderful. Of course, Jim Stevenson, of course, the first person, I think, the first person to do behavioural genetic studies of ADHD, together with Robert Goodman, and Jim Swanson was the first person to identify some of these specific candidate genes in ADHD. So greatly indebted to them. So we know that a variant of the serotonin transporter gene, which is a gene that regulates serotonin function within the amygdala, equals greater amygdala reactivity to aversive stimuli. Is that same variant associated with delay aversion? More sensitive, so does it relate to delay aversion? And we found exactly that it does. The second question, and it's my great pleasure to introduce the team from Leuven for this study. And this is really going right up to date. And this question is, does the amygdala in ADHD, is it hypo-responsive to delay cues? So we've got Marina here, who's here, and the head of the team in Leuven, and Saskia, and Jürgen, and Jeroen, who's the brilliant PhD student who led this study. So we used a task called the EDDI. And now I've been dying to have a task that's named after me for a long time. We've actually just invented the Emily. Believe it or not, we have got the EDDI and the Emily. But this is the escape delay incentive task. And basically, in this case, I just mentioned two trials. In one trial, we have a cue on the... So this is in the scanner. So we're doing MRI, fMRI measures of brain activity in the scanner to this cue. And this cue is a red circle that appears on the computer inside the scanner. And that leads to a target. You have to respond. Then you get feedback. Actually, it's just to illustrate. I know that isn't the feedback you get. And then you get a delay consequence. So this cue, to somebody who hates delay, is going to be pretty aversive. So you can see the prediction is quite simple. And we used 3 levels of delay, 2, 6, and 14 seconds. And then we had another trial. We actually had 3 trials, but I'll focus on the other trial for simplicity. No delay trial. And we had a different cue. So this time they see a blue cue, they think, oh my golly, great, I haven't got any delay coming. And in this case, there was no delay, whatever you did. So what did we find? And we predict, of course, hyperactivation in ADHD, in the amygdala, to those delay cues. That's exactly what we found, as well as in a whole network of regions that have implicated in emotional processing more generally. So not just the amygdala, but this network within the brain. So we've had very compelling evidence for the mediating role of this amygdala activation. And then we tested that directly. We asked people whether they like delay. We have a questionnaire which is called the Quick Delay Questionnaire. So that's quite good. 10 items. If anybody wants to use it, it's great. It's got a lot of face validity because one of the items is I hate waiting. So I think that's a pretty high face validity. It's very discriminating for ADHD from controls. And what we found is when we looked at the relationship between ADHD and delay aversion, very strong. When we put in the amygdala response, we found a partial mediation by amygdala response. So that does tend to suggest that individual variation in delay aversion is being driven by this biological difference. We don't know where it comes from. We've shown that it's correlated with structural differences in the amygdala as well, more recently. So it's interesting whether it's experiences are shaping these amygdala developments, or they're somehow grounded in genetic factors? Interesting question. Longitudinal research. So the last one brings me right up to date, and this is the whole topic of mind wandering. And I'm so glad that Phil is here. Phil Asherson is Mr. Mind Wandering at the Institute of Psychiatry. Not that your mind wanders, not as much as mine anyway. But I'm going to give you a little bit of an alternative view of mind wandering. Could it be delay aversion? So we know that ADHD, people with ADHD's minds wander. It's kind of a new focus on inattentiveness, more like internalized inattentiveness, if you like. And it's really come about, I think, the interest, because people are now focused on adults, where the symptomatology is much more internalized than it was in childhood. And it tends to be, take the form of mind wandering or an internal restlessness, and leading on to anxiety and so forth. So far, Phil and I are on the same page. It's thought to be linked to default mode dysfunction. And the default mode is a fascinating brain network that was really identified when people stopped being obsessed with task-related activations and looked at what happens when people's brains aren't activated by a task. It's called the default mode because it's active during resting, and it underpins introspective states. So prospection about the future, autobiographical memory, mind wandering, daydreaming. So this network is activated during those processes. But of course, if you want to then do a task, you need to switch it off. Because if you're constantly daydreaming during a task, because this brain network is too active, then you're going to obviously not do the task very well. So again, Javier Castellanos and I wrote a paper in... it falls flat because people don't have any taste in music, so they don't know who Tammy Terrell is. She's one of... Look her up, she's wonderful. Anyway, she's not as good a singer as Javier, but yeah. So we wrote a paper together called... basically, it framed a so-called default mode interference hypothesis back in 2007. And we argued that in ADHD they couldn't switch off their default mode, so it kept coming back and interfering over time. Again, that's been quite an influential idea. And when they can't switch it off, their minds wander. That's the sort of idea. But could mind wandering actually also, rather than being dysfunctional, that they can't switch the default mode off, could it actually be purposefully chosen because it's functional? You can probably work out where I'm going. So remember this beautiful... I can give anybody. It's free to download off the internet. It's actually wonderful. It's quite meditative, actually, looking at it. Daydreamers lose track of time. Yeah? We do. They do. Could mind wandering be a way of coping with delay aversion by changing how time is experienced, just like other forms of inattention, but in childhood much more externalized forms of inattention? So we want to extend those externalized forms to internalized forms. And of course you can think about it as an extension of this little model that I presented. So we have externalized behaviors that are functional because they alter the way delay is experienced. Maybe mind wandering is functional in the same way. So this is Schaefer. I've been so blessed. I counted it up. I've actually supervised 39 PhD students over my career, and I'm so proud of every single one of them. Some of them are here, and Schaefer was a brilliant PhD student. She's now a lecturer in Taiwan, and she did a study where she compared the default mode activity, she measured by EEG. So we isolated the source of the default mode using EEG, between a resting condition, so the default mode should be on, a forced to wait condition, so they have to wait. We think we actually lied. This isn't normal in psychology experiments, but I think we actually lied. We said it's broken. You're going to have to wait until somebody comes to fix it. But then we told them afterwards, you debrief afterwards, and it's okay. Then we worked, so they did a 5-minute reaction time task, and then they chose to wait for 5 minutes. So we looked at, so we didn't know what would happen during the waiting. A lot of folks on the resting brain, this is the first study of the waiting brain. Now you might say it's just like resting. It's just like resting if you're waiting. But actually, you'll see it's not. So what we found was that, as we predicted from our default mode interference hypothesis, the controls, that's the ones who aren't ADHD, they showed a decrease, an attenuation of the default mode when you had to work. So they switched it off. The ADHD did switch it off, but not as much. These are big, big effects. When they had to choose to wait, the controls went back. The controls carried on suppressing the default mode, even though you'd say, well, it's just like resting. They're not doing anything, but it was a goal-directed activity. So it's kind of interesting. The ADHD don't do that. So they engage the default mode network when they're waiting. Now you could say, well, there's a whole range of explanations for that. But we measured delay aversion using the quick delay questionnaire again. And we found that the levels of default mode activity in that waiting brain were correlated with how delay averse you were. So the more you hated delay, the higher the levels of default mode activity in that situation. Again, we need loads more studies to do, but I think it's a kind of interesting finding, the relationship between, what's mediating it? Emotional responses, immediate response, we don't know. It's kind of interesting. We'll see. So just let's revisit where we've got to after all these years. What have we done? Was it worthwhile? Well, I think it was worthwhile. Eric, I think it was worthwhile. Delay aversion affects a significant subgroup of individuals with ADHD, and that's a big group of people. It drives a broad range of ADHD behaviours. This is a hypothesis still, of course, but we think there's supportive evidence, both external and perhaps internal. We need to work on that a bit more, and not just impulsive choice. It's influenced by socio-environmental aversive experiences during development. Now, this is an area we've hardly done anything on, because you need long-term longitudinal studies to look at the impact of that social environment. And in fact, very pleased that I've got a new PhD student funded jointly by Hong Kong and University of Hong Kong and King's, looking at cross-cultural differences in the impact of paternal response to impulsivity on children. So that should be on children at risk for ADHD. It varies as a function of genetic and neurobiological factors that determine how these are processed. So what's next? Well, clearly, this is not astrophysics. This is a very practical science. And if it doesn't improve the lives of people with ADHD, then it has been not a waste of time, perhaps. In parallel with this, I've been working with my colleagues, and Margaret Thompson, David Daly, and Kathy Laver-Bradbury, over the last 20 or so years, on developing the new forest parenting programme. And we've gradually adapted it, so we've increasing. It's a parenting programme focused on preschool children, and it includes elements of cognitive training and attempt to alter these sorts of networks that are impaired. And I'd like to develop that further, and really to go earlier even in development than preschool. And so, working with Mark Johnson, Tony Charman, and Emily Jones and Sam Wazzle, all here. So I'm so pleased. The future looks bright in that sense. We're looking at working with very young infants and trying to strengthen the executive function and those brain networks that underpin executive function using gaze-controlled cognitive training. I haven't got time to go into detail, but it's fascinating, so if you have a chance, do look it up. But I'd like to go further than that. So I'm working with Chiara Nazati and David Edwards to try and get a more fundamental view. So we're doing structural imaging in children at risk for ADHD or temperamentally at risk for ADHD. Again, talking at 2-year-olds, led by my research fellow Cassia, the idea is to build on that basic knowledge to see if we can target those networks that are involved in early risk, neurobiological risk for those pathways that we've talked about through ADHD. I mean, this is a very ambitious research. Obviously, it's very difficult to do brain imaging with 2-year-old children, and it's very difficult to do interventions with 2-year-old children. The only people in the room not looking happy are the people of the Interstars team, because it's so hard to recruit those, those young people and families. So that's really what I'd like to do in the future, to see if we can really interrupt these pathways, working on a principle that prevention is better than cure. our parenting program is lots of good things, but it doesn't really fundamentally change those core ADHD deficits. But if we go early, maybe we can when the brain's more plastic. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Edmund, for a brilliant lecture. I think it's such an exquisite and perfectly formed story, even though it's not one that's completed. I think we will save the questions for the reception, and I'll ask Eric Taylor to come up and give the vote of thanks.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm not sure a vote is entirely necessary. Apart from anything else, votes are out of fashion. They give the wrong answers. And you've made it very plain from your attitudes about how much you've enjoyed this and how much you've focused on this. The gratification has been intense. I have enjoyed it very much. And I will just say a few words about why I've enjoyed it so much. Because, first of all, it's treating very much children as agents. The children who are making their own decisions and following their functions. And I'm remembering that when I was trying, in the days before Edmund showed me how to think about these things, then I was playing with Walter Mischel type tests about choosing the immediate marshmallow or the delayed multiple marshmallows. And I remember one of the girls saying to me, am I supposed to be a good girl for this one? And I thought that was very informative. And I remembered one of the girls in the Mischel experiments, who, after the experimenters had gone through whether you choose the one immediately or the three at the end of a wait, she'd waited behind and she'd stolen the whole bag of marshmallows. which was good for her. Yes, I'm sure she's done fine, actually, that girl. It does recognise how alterations, how quirks of the brain that can make for disabilities, but it does respect how the brain is trying to compensate for its quirks, and it's thinking very strongly about issues like how you build that up, how you build up the trust that reward will come if you wait for it, how, for instance, you don't get into the way that the poets have often talked about delayed gratification, because poets who are usually daydreamers have often been very contemptuous of those who wait for rewards. From Villon to Philip Larkin, Omar Khayyam puts it very well. Some for the glories of this world, and some sigh for the prophet's paradise to come. Take the cash and let the credit go, nor heed the rumble of a distant drum. But heeding that rumbling is prone to be talking about, not only from individual differences, but also from the experiences you've been through, the cultural and learning experiences that children have been through. This is like the consistency and predictability of reward, of frustrative non-reward, of the schedules that you're actually living under. I think increasing technology is making it more and more likely that we can study those in the real world and study. So that's going to be another future line to watch from this development. It's been pleasantly complex, and I think that's also a sign about how in the future we shall understand the neurodevelopmental disabilities much more in the terms of separate components of underlying neuropsychological process, much more than in terms of categories of illness. So I think it's a strong move towards that, and I welcome it greatly. It's been very enjoyable. I hope the young people, especially in the audience, the early career researchers, as they're on the grind of the PhD or on the grind of the grants treadmill, if it will help them to remember how pleasant and interesting and entertaining science can be, how playful it often is. And I remember the great pleasure when he was explaining to me about thinking about the functional purpose of not waiting. and thinking how remarkably stupid of me not to have thought of that before. Right, T.H. Huxley was thinking when he encountered the theory of natural selection. And of course the poets had thought of it for a long time. It's been a very generous talk, and his interactions with other scientists are clearly very important to his thinking and the way it's gone. And again, the lesson for the earlier career of science is that science is social. Science is a process of debate and argument, and the more we can build that in institutionally, rather than have people fettered into programmes, the better, I think. And I also liked it because it's unfinished. It's another good sign for the future. And as he's finished by saying that it enables him to look at the antecedents in terms of the complex ways that children have learned about delay and the nature of delay, and the way that the brain function enables them to react sensibly in that kind of way, or to acquire what we call self-control, or he would call, I suppose, socialisation. Then we shall get a long way further, and we shall also get into the kind of understanding that's leading to interventions, both in education and in family life and in therapy. So for the future advances that we'll get in how to analyse children's problems and how to get beyond diagnosis, and for the ways that we shall think about modifying those processes in the future. Thank you very much, Edmund.